and working with the customers. So Professor Smith asked me to give a talk, just focus on the use cases and the applications and also the challenges. So I probably what we'll do is basically quickly go over what a flare is. So I'm working on NVIDIA flare, and then we'll go quickly, most of the time, mostly in the use cases, and then we'll to the challenges. So, everybody already know what a fed learning is, and then we don't move the data, only move the models. So I don't need to explain too much of this slide. So what is a flare? So NVIDIA flare is a open source application runtime environment, essentially an SDK for doing federal learning. So we've been working on this for many, many years. And so actually before Flare open sourced, the NVIDIA research team has been working that for 2018, 2019, and then eventually open sourced in 2021. So it has been for many years. So from the get-go, Flare is actually used for production. It's designed for 20 hospitals. The first use case of 20 hospitals around the world during the COVID time to do the oxygen predictions for the patients. So it's a design for enterprise scales and production ready. So the deployments are really flexible, so we can support on-prem, on cloud, and any hybrid. Where the framework is model agnostic, so basically we don't care is PyTorch, TensorFlows, scikit-learn, XGBoost, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what kind of domains you're using, whether it's for healthcare or scientific computing or any other models. So because it's a start with for the enterprises, so basically very emphasize on the enterprise security, focusing who has the control, who has the security. So it's not a server controls everything. So every hospital on the site actually control the privacy policies and associated securities. So of course, we're talking about the privacies and the privacy enhancing technology all come in the picture, whether using differential privacies and homomorphic encryptions. And recently we support the confidential computings, and the confidential computings has two sides. One side is do the similar things like a secure aggregation. The other side is for IP protections. We actually, our recent release, last October, we released on-prem IP protections. So that's essentially think about a model's broadcast to the other side. You don't want a model being copied away. So essentially locked down on the client side. So our framework is not locked down. It's actually quite extensive. Pretty much you can replace any layers in our components. Everything's plug-in event-based. So we have simulations and applications. So here's, because we don't have a lot of time to dive into different areas, so I want to highlight some of the few features. And so this is kind of our latest release with data science-friendly APIs. Essentially, think about it. If you're saying, well, I have a machine learning problem. I already have a PyTorch. Can I just make a few lines of code changes to become, federal learning, compliant? So we have something called a client API. If you see those highlighted areas, like literally 4 lines of code changes for this case is for PyTorch Lightning, that's become a client-side training talking to, federal learning. The other side say, okay, wait a minute, if I do federal learning, I need to do fed average, fed ops, and all these other algorithms. So what are you choosing? So we'll have something called a fed recipe. Essentially, if you count it, it's like 4 or 5 lines of code. And essentially, that gives you the piece of code that actually you can run either in simulations, in production. We also have a local sort of in between we call it POC mode, essentially like a production, but it's running on the same machine. So you can run them pretty quickly. So the other part of the recent releases is we released last October as well. So once you're talking about these, we call it cross silos at hospitals, banks. But what if you bought across devices, right? So if you have millions of devices, how do you do that? So to support that, we actually defined this hierarchical federal learning. Basically, you can put in different layers rather than just a client server. In between, there's a relay nodes. You can have hierarchical aggregations. And then for between the edge node and the mobiles, we have these web gateways. And then on top of that, you say, well, it's a mobile. It's not controllable. I don't know when he will actually even return back to the model back to me, or basically the Wi-Fi connection will be disconnected. So to support that, we are using the asynchronized FM models. And there's a lot of application tools. So as I said, we can spend an hour on Flare's features, but I'm mostly probably interested in the use cases. People say, who using Flare? What is it used for? So here's kind of a little quick summary of the things being used. Flare, because it's built for productions, has been used widely for many, many cases. And of course, the biggest case is healthcare. Healthcare and life sciences. And among that, the biggest category is cancer research. So there's at least half dozen of the active research projects right now across the globe. 50, 60. Last time counted was like around 50 in August, and right now it's 60. It could be more. Frankly, there's a lot of people don't tell me. So it could be easily around more than that. So there's a lot of activities around the cancer, basically. The other big part is drug discoveries. You probably heard a lot of news around the recent announcements, which will touch a few of those. Medical AIs, and essentially those are beyond the drug discovery and cancer research. There's a lot of near future care needs, predictions, clinical trials, a rare disease, a patient and study matching, and many other cases around those areas. And there's also around the medical devices and all the other areas. Beyond the healthcare, and there's also financial services. Of course, the financial services are mostly focused on anti-money laundering, fraud detections, and then recently also adding federated query. They call it a federated mule account, essentially try to find out whether the other side has the so-called mule account, essentially the fake account for illegal transactions. And beyond the financial services, we also have the other two categories of what we call scientific computing or national security, if you like it. So, for example, the Sandia National Lab, which I'll touch on, and a bunch of other national labs get together to train the large language models, or they build a platform for internal scientific studies. And the transportation, of course, self-driving cars across country kind of training. So that's kind of a summary. So we'll highlight a few cases. This is a kind of an announcement just recently, Eli Lilly, so-called Tune Lab. Eli Lilly Tune Lab is a new sort of a new company formed recently. And what its purpose is basically saying, okay, I have all these models I have been using my proprietary data and my AI model. I trained it privately, a dozen of the models. How can I make it, fine-tune, make it better predictions? So what they did is set a federated learning framework using Flare, and basically gave the model away for the selective startups. The startups essentially use the model to tune, using their own wet lab data to tune. So this gives two benefits. From Eli Lilly's perspective, it's a kind of a strategic move. Essentially, instead of my own R&D, do additional fine-tuning, do all the stuff which you don't have all the data, and they actually gave away the quote-unquote gave away, shared away with the models with the other labs. They don't see their data, but the other lab jump starts instead of running from the scratch, very high-quality models, and then start to fine-tune it. So Eli Lilly get the better models, and startup get a jump start. So it's kind of a win-win. And Eli Lilly also get the early access to the new discoveries and all the other stuff. Some even say that they own the discovery platform by doing this. The other one is a Cancer AI Alliance. So this Cancer AI Alliance is for medical centers, top-notch medical centers. You see the Johns Hopkins, Dana-Farber, Fred Hutch, and also Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. So, and not only these four, but also backed by all the hyperscalers. All these, each one gave a donation, a lot of money. And on top of that, AI2, Deloitte, and also Selenium, NVIDIA, of course. So give contributions. And this is running on Flare. So they basically try to speed up the cancer research. Instead of having one set of data, spend years, projects to approval and all that stuff to get a study, they want to speed up so much so they can do, probably many projects in a few months. Another pharma cases, this is they call the Federated AI for therapeutic engineering. So their goal is essentially to fine-tuning these large language models to predicting protein, certain chemical properties. The models could be something like this, and the amplify. You can see. I hope you can see this. Some of the there's amplified models and there are other. Oh, here. Yes, I have two models, amplified models. So those are kind of protein models, language models, and you can downstreaming. So this one took a long time to get the legal approvals, and last September they marked it were here. So that's where they started the phase 1. This is also using Flare to back it. So this literally just now. My VP is on my way to Taiwan. So the Taiwan government have the Ministry of Health and Welfare. So they basically established, they call it external clinical trial validation. So among 4 medical centers in Taiwan, and which consists of about 16 hospitals. So what they do is essentially, this is kind of together with the equivalent US FDA approval. So there's a TFDA. So as part of the approval process, you need to do a validating. So, and not only that, you notice that the English the title is international because they also link up for the Mahidol universities in Thailand. So it's a cross-country platform. So this is another example. Talk about the who using it. So this one is DOE, Department of Energy, and has 3 national labs. And actually, there's another one. I didn't show here, just shows 3. There's another one, but this project has 3. So it's a Sandia Lab, Lawrence Livermore, and also Los Alamos, and basically these, together try to train language models for classical informations. In these cases, they call the models Chandler, which is a signal. It's a city's name in the middle of all these 3 labs. So that's where. But notice is very interesting. So they're using high-performance computer on each lab. The different names, they have different Helios and etc. and all that stuff. But also the server is actually hosted by one of these servers. They don't want to put anything in the public. And the communication actually using SSH tunnel through them because there's no other ways to communicate. Because they each have their own private data, so they don't want to share. So, okay, switch gears to financial services. This is the Swiss banks. Swiss banks has, a lot of data in there. They see the transactions, but they don't see the account data. So they want to use this for fraud detection, a mu account. They call it mu account sharing. So, so essentially, Federated try to find the mu account. So this is what I was showing is a phase 1, which is they use the synthetic data. They are actually start a phase 2 now with a Flare, which is using real bank data. So this is the second 2. I probably there's JP Morgan also. JP Morgan Bank in New York and Royal Bank of Canada plus another startup Deep Tempo also did a study and they talked about GTC. But since they haven't published the paper, I think I didn't put it here. So this is another use case, NVIDIA itself. This case is for self-driving cars. Think about it. If you train many self-driving car models, and there's many models, and at least a dozen of those for parking, sign, video recognitions, many other models. But if you train these models for each countries, and then you need to get approval for each case here, means just approval will take forever. So in that case, they basically want to leveraging all the models from different countries, and you can just train one model. But the problem is the data, say in China, cannot be exported to US. But even you can, like it take about 3 months to copy a 1 batch model there, and it take forever. And economically, sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So this case is they decided to using Flare to train this model. The server actually is in Japan. So they send 2 clients, and they actually concurrently running about 20, 30 jobs in each time. Each job is for 1 model. So, and they publish, these are the early production in several, if you see the notice, the date is 24. That's 2 years before this. So, so this is just one example. So for example, they use the US models only. They can only recognize this whole sign. But if you use the combined Federated model, they can recognize all the little pieces on the different piece. So this is probably the last example. I have more, but I don't have time to, to show. This is, you probably, if you see the link in, actually, there's a news today, the Earth 2 just opened, the NVIDIA just announced the Earth 2 and the weather models today, announced all 3 open models on Earth 2. But the Earth, in order to train Earth 2, these, for weather predictions, you do a lot of fluid dynamics and all the other calculations. The data cannot move either. So how do you do this even data processing? So this example actually is not machine learning at all. It's actually data processing. So what Earth-2 has this, in order to do the training model, you have to get the data, as you said. So they're using FLAIR as a data processing engine, which is they call a federated data mesh. So that's where the data is coordinating all these pieces. So I think I gave you enough different areas of the use cases, but let's talk about the challenges. So from what am I talking to? I'm talking to tons of customers. And so there's essentially two categories of customers I see. One is from universities, academias, and so, or people who care about publishing papers. What we notice that is, frankly, if you search all these published papers, very, very tiny percent of these research publishings using any framework. NVIDIA, FLAIR included, Flower and all the others. So, which is not people just not using framework. Apparently, framework is actually hinder them flexibilities or usabilities. So that's its challenge. So that's one of the things that FLAIR, actually to do. One of our next release is besides the two API I show you, we call it a collaborate API. It's almost like there's no FLAIR there. It was you just make a function call. So we're testing it right now, but it's going to release in another release. So how to make this thing so simple? The setup is so simple. You're basically say, well, this is almost like I'm using a full loop, except once I finish, I don't need to convert it to a production-ready delivery. So that's one challenge. Is I think it will still need a lot of innovations. The other part is since we expose a lot of industries, so basically the most of the challenges coming from the industries. The first piece is, it's this legal and regulatory approval pieces. As I mentioned, that FATE projects take about 9 months to do the legal approval. So for healthcare, essentially, there's a legal, there's a security, and also the IRBs, right? So the Internal Review Board. Can you even do the LM on the data? I can, because there's a lot of privacy there. I couldn't even use LLM in some of the cases. So that's kind of say, how do we make the technology or process in such a way that we can shorten this to make it to say, well, it is need to go through, but it's not as difficult. For regulatory stuff, can we have in certain certification or something, or code governance or data governance, whatever the process, the technology make this easier to approve? Of course, the audit process is important. Can you audit 2 years? Say, because nobody can watch everything, every time. If something happened, people say, oh, I'm not responsible for that, because otherwise. But if you have a certain way to say you can trace back 2 years or whatever, see exactly what happens, what causing it, and that helps, right? So securities. So how do we make the security so convincing that the CISO can easily approve? Or the other part, I won't be part of it, but now I don't want part of it. Can I take my pieces away, this unlearning pieces? My data is in your model, but I want to take it out. Can we do that? So far the federal learning, when we do the federal learning, most of it talking about the models, the algorithms. We never talk about the data itself because we assume the data is there. But frankly, the data is the biggest part. When you do the federal learnings, you don't see the data on the other side. So there's a data schema, data harmonization, data qualities. That is a big pain point. So how do we do this to coordinate the ETLs and coordinate the data harmonizations in the federal setting? And the other part, which is a professor has already hinted, is there's a business setting. So, okay, why should I even join? What's it for me? If I put this in infrastructures, that means I need to put the money. Where's the return on investment? So that's the from business perspective. I need to have some reason to join the federation. And then the other one is the incentive model. So even I joined, my data versus your data, high quality data versus the amount of data. What's my piece of a pie? What's my incentive model? So those are. I don't think there's frankly there's very few people working on this. So there's a few startups that have come out of something, but. Frankly, this is the pieces, and sometimes the people, especially for financial services, they say, "What's my piece?" technology, of course, say, can we make it so simple to scale up, scale down, easy setup? So those are, from businesses, legal, regulatory approval, incentive, the technology. There's a multiple angle of things for federal learning adoptions. So I think that's my last slide.
That's great. Normally I would stop for questions, but we have the panel coming up later where we can ask you lots of questions.
Sure.
So I might get Sean to come up. Yeah, so we'll hear from Sean Augenstein next, who is a staff research scientist at Google. Has done a lot of work in federated learning, optimization, machine learning. So excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Virginia. Okay.
Oh, sure.
On this side. Oh, sorry.
While that's going, can I
Yeah.
put that in your pocket?
Uh-huh.
You just choose how you want to display it. Let's go back up to the displays. Choose content.
Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Virginia, and all the organizers for inviting me to come. This is great. The last time I was at Simon's workshop was 2019. It was, it's interesting to reflect on the foundation model era and how much things have changed in the last 5 to 7 years in terms of FL and, in general, FL focused on improving mobile device apps, which is what I'll talk about today. So Google has a large interest in performing FL for improving Pixel and Android AI experiences. And so thinking about the context of the current, the foundation model era, quote unquote, we have for many years been working on cross-device federated learning, so the pattern where computation goes out to mobile phones and processes locally on data and comes back. But some challenges have emerged as LLMs became ubiquitous, and maybe I guess one way to think about the LLM era is we're now dealing with much larger scale. But I think what has been sort of the most salient difference about the LLM era, and Ginger, you had a slide on this that I think got at it nicely, is like the way I talk about this is like in ML 1.0, we had a model that was like a patient on the operating table. And maybe a model evaluation, you can think of it, the analogy is like a nurse who is monitoring vitals, and training or fine tuning is like a surgeon who is going in and unclogging arteries or something. And the difference in 2.0 is that now models are also serving as the surgeons and the nurses. It's not just a matter of this thing that's being improved on the table, that's that's a model. But now also we are using models as well as sort of assistive tools to actually do the thing that's improving the model of interest. So for a number of reasons that involves a whole lot more computation, it makes it hard to do certain things on the edge. So this is kind of some friction points that have emerged in sort of our cross-device federated learning setting. And also, and this is, I think, other folks from Google will talk more about this later in the week, but we've had sort of a strong progression of higher and higher thresholds of privacy. We made a lot of progress on privacy in the sense of data minimization and data anonymization. And certainly of the moment for us is verifiable privacy. So how can we make what we're doing, not just take Google's word for it, but externally verifiable to independent parties. And so with those two sort of threads of much more computation involved, now that LLMs are serving as the doctors and the nurses in the operating room, and also this desire for verifiability, we have been really centering our efforts around federated learning in trusted execution environments, or TEEs. So TEEs provide this ability to provide a chain of trust that extends from the client to the server. And so shifting sort of traditionally, a schematic of federated learning would look like pushing some model artifacts out to the edge and doing computation there. Here you'll notice it's sort of inverted, right? So in our T-based learning paradigm, we're sending encrypted data to the server to be operated on by some open source programs in a trusted execution environment. The model resides in the T. And then we will perform updates. Those could be things like gradient backpropagation to update model parameters, or it could be evolution-based approaches on synthetic data. And after processing, we can release these things under verifiable, privacy constraints. So yeah, it's really sort of shifting where the computation happens now to happen in the server in a trusted enclave as opposed to at the edge. So this pattern enables a number of different learning and analytics type programs. One aspect of what we do now that I think is worth calling out is kind of a duality, I guess, of federated and collaborative learning is there's really two ways to go about it. You can do direct evaluation or fine-tuning on the artifacts of interest that you're learning, LoRa's for an LLM or prompts or whatever. And you can, so that basically involves composing directly the privacy protections and the privacy computations with the actual learning actions. And in so doing, you probably can get the best quote unquote bang for your buck in terms of a privacy utility trade-off. But an alternative approach is synthetic data generation, where you can first synthesize a number of representative examples that are representative of the private distribution, but are privacy preserving, and then separately use those for evaluation or tuning of those artifacts. And while that's not the best bang for the buck, but you get other benefits such as you can separate learning from data generation, you can reuse the synthetic data generation. So I think both of those have valuable applications independently. So within those sort of two, that duality of paradigms of either doing things directly or indirectly on synthetic data, there's a number of other things that are also worth mentioning that are possible. So prompt tuning. So I think this is another aspect of the foundation model era, but to me in ML 1.0, the weights were really the artifact of interest that we were optimizing to make a model perform differently. And now in sort of the evolution of transformers and LLMs, it's very much the case now that oftentimes the thing of interest that we wish to tune to get the behavior of an LLM to operate in a particular way is the prompt. So you could think of algorithms like GEPA or other forms of automatic prompt optimization, but sometimes it's the case that the weights, the model parameters themselves remain fixed, and it's purely the prompt that we are tuning under, to achieve some objective of higher performance. So I think that's an interesting aspect of the foundation model era, that both sort of weights and sort of semantic prompt input are both artifacts of interest for optimization. Personalization, that might be one that's better saved for the panel discussion, but certainly personalization is my own personal research interest and is very germane in the foundation model era. And additional things are possible by doing these things in T's. We can do hyperparameter tuning, we can mix client and server data much more easily. So so in general, we're excited about T-based learning and the possibilities of doing verifiably private learning in the data center. And this is just sort of to mention a couple of recent, things we published in our blog over the last year that relate to this. So in 2025, we showed the ability to do verifiably private computation on federated data. This was learning new words. And this was kind of us, demonstrating the ability to do verifiable privacy. Later on in the year, we took this a little further, and we were doing, this kind of gets at this whole concept of LLMs as nurses and surgeons. We were doing verifiably private cloud compute with Gen AI. So this was one where we used Gemma, which is a LLM, to take unstructured summaries in Pixel Recorder and provide some insights, sort of topics or themes of what these summaries were about, and then compute analytics on those structured summaries. So this was really using LLM as a tool in the trusted enclave to structure what was previously unstructured and then derive analytics on top of that. And also just a number of advances on sort of the representativeness of synthetic data and what's possible in emulating a private distribution of data with synthetic examples. Yeah, so I think, I don't know, we're quite excited about what FL means in the foundation model era. Not to, I guess, spoil it, but there's certainly FL has a huge role to play in the foundation model era, and foundation models haven't changed anything on that regard. But yeah, I look forward to talking more in the panel discussion. So yeah, thanks.
All right, great. So next up we have Sewon, who's an assistant professor here at UC Berkeley, and is also a research scientist at AI2, and has been looking at some work in collaboratively learning, LLMs, and foundation models, so very relevant.
Can you escape out of the full screen again?
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Sewon. I'm an assistant professor in Berkeley X, also part of BEAR, and also spending my part-time at AI2. Yeah, thanks for organizing the workshop and for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about collaborative learning in foundation model. Just as a background, my background has been in NLP, and I'm most excited about building a foundation model, like pre-trained large language models for better performance. So federated learning or privacy is actually a new concept for me, but I've been realizing that to build a better foundation model and to build a better pre-trained model, collaborative learning is essential. So I've been learning about this by necessity. Cool. Okay, so as I said, my personal interest is more on building a performance foundation model, so I probably do not have to repeat that. Recently, we have seen rapid progress in foundation model by benefiting from scale. So this graph is just a graph from Llama 3 technical report. The specific graph doesn't matter that much, but it's just to show that the model performance grows by scaling both the data and compute. So as an NLP researcher, the relevant question is, will we continue to benefit from scaling further? Will we put a bunch of scaling, data, compute, and then achieve super intelligence? Maybe the answer is yes, I don't know. But the question I'm interested in asking, if it's not the case, then why that would be the case? And I argue that there could be many different reasons, but one of the problems is on data, and in particular on data becoming fragmented. So what do I mean by data becoming fragmented? I'm talking about proprietary data sets, where data sets are owned by different owners, different institutions, or different parties that cannot be gathered into a centralized location. So previously, much of pre-training data for large language model has been public web data like Common Crawl. They have been driving much of the performance. However, these days, Common Crawl is largely considered to be limited. It's actually less because of quantity, but more because of the quality and also domain coverage. For instance, these days, people are excited about highly specialized domain like math, code, finance, legal, news, STEM, and so on. And then for those domains, Common Crawl is largely limited. Or in other words, we've already exploited usable data from Common Crawl for those domains, but now more valuable data is considered to be often restricted or proprietary, that is, they're owned by different data owners and are not really publicly available. The other thing is even the data that was once publicly available is becoming proprietary. For instance, this is a graph from one of the paper called Constant and Crisis that shows that the Common Crawl data that was once public is now getting more restricted over time. That is reasonable because data owners realize that their data is very critical for large language model training, so they want to protect themselves. And it is a good thing to protect data owners and make sure that they can be, their data is not just publicly around. So that's the context for data becoming fragmented, but what's the problem of that? Well, the current training recipe doesn't really support fragmented data. So just kind of as a review, how large language model training works is the AI developers would first start with collecting all the data that they can collect. And typically they're coming from different sources like Wikipedia, books, Reddit, code, and so on. But essentially, they gather it into one centralized location, and then they would uniformly shuffle it and then train one model on this data. So even though it consists of multiple sources, they basically make it as a single data set and train the model on that. And that works when your data is public. However, here we are talking about the data that are owned by different data owners that cannot be located into a single centralized location. So in that case, you don't really have a good training recipe that can allow leveraging those data. So that's why I think we do need a collaborative training approach for foundation model, in particular LLM pre-training that was previously not really considered to be an area where collaborative learning or federated learning was relevant. And in particular, I'm thinking of a framework like this, where there are multiple parties that own their own data. One of them can represent public data, and then they collaboratively build a single unified model. So one question is, we already have great research on federated learning, so can we apply federated learning? And I think the answer to this depends on what the definition of federated learning is. In a broader sense of broader definition, everything can be considered federated learning. But I'll focus on a conventional definition of federated learning, where there is a synchronized training, different parties exchange gradient updates to build a model. Then I think there are a few limitations. One is obviously the fact that it requires synchronized training can lead to a lot of logistical burden and also infra challenges. And also, federated learning does not support flexible opt-in and opt-out. So these limitations are particularly critical in large foundation model pre-training. First, this is cross-institutional by nature. So it's a little different from cross-device federated learning, where you already have a centralized party that can standardize the infra and everything. Here, dealing with logistics burden and infra burden across different parties is going to be not very practical. Also, each training run is very expensive and commitment can change. And that can lead practical usefulness as well. For instance, it's possible that a data owner want to join later on or want to opt out later on. And in order to do that, with federated learning, you'll have to retrain the model. But because of the fact that each training run is so expensive, this is not likely to be very efficient. So because of that, I proposed that we need a new form of collaborated learning. And in particular, my research does it by using a modular architecture that can support distributed training. And in our framework, it works like this. We first start with a base model that is trained solely on public data, like Common Crawl. Then there is a set of data owners where each of them can take this base model, branch out from it, and then train on their data locally. So each data set still doesn't leave their local environment. And then once the model is trained, the parameters are shared back to the public space, and we can combine them to make it a single unified model. This approach has two unique properties. First, we can do collaborative training without data sharing because each data owner trained the model solely locally. They never shared the data to someone else. And of course, they can have their own timeline for when to train their model and use their own infra without needing to coordinate with other parties. The second thing is the opt-in and opt-out is flexible, so a new data owner can join at any time after all the other parties already train a combined model. And if they want to opt out later, they can do that without needing to disrupt the rest of the model or requiring retraining. So that's kind of the main approach, and I think there are many different ways to achieve this. One particular approach we have been looking in is to use mixture of experts. So for those who are not familiar with mixture of experts, it looks like this. So the left is a regular transformer that have a single FFN. Mixture of experts replaces this FFN into a set of smaller FFNs called experts. And the idea is you can selectively train a subset of them depending on what your input is. This mixture of experts architecture is already the industry standard in large foundation model. Our proposal is to leverage the modularity of this architecture. So how it works is we have a base model. Data owner takes this base model, and what they do is to duplicate the FFN to make it essentially a mixture of experts model with two experts. And then they freeze the shared layers as well as the first FFN and only train the second FFN. Once they're trained, they contribute the second FFN back to the public space. So all the other parties will do the same, and we gather all the model components contributed by these data owners to build a single mix of experts. So here the architecture is exactly identical to standard mixture of experts, meaning that if you already have an infra for deployment or serving, then you can reuse it without needing to change anything. And as I said earlier, the participation is flexible. So for instance, if one of the data owners want to opt out later on, we can do that simply by dropping model components contributed by that data owner. And the rest of the model is guaranteed to not use the data in any way. Okay, I think I only had 10 minutes, so that's at the end of the talk. So just to summarize, I mentioned that for foundation model training and scaling in general, data is the #1 driver, but it also can be limiting the progress we can make with foundation model. And in particular, valuable data is becoming proprietary, restricted, and fragmented, and current LLM training recipe doesn't really support this kind of setup. Therefore, we propose that we should have a new approach for collaborative LLM pre-training that was previously not really the topic that was discussed in conventional federated learning. And in particular, we need this framework because we want to be able to collaborate with multiple data owners while respecting them, meaning they should ensure they remain having full control over their data, so without needing to share the data to public, and also have an opt-out options later on. And I didn't highlight it that much, but it also requires flexible inference, meaning data can be added and removed at any time, not only when they want to change the commitment, but even in real time, for instance, depending on the user or the permission level. So I also shared one piece of proposal that is using the modular architecture from mixture of experts model. And I didn't really show the result, but we showed that it seems to be the case that the mixture of experts models trained collaboratively is able to preserve individual models' capability within a unified model. And we are still working on how to make it more scalable. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Oh, quick question?
That's a good question. So is this the same as a flex elbow?
Yeah, I presented the flexible, yes.
All right, thanks so much, Sewon. Great, so next up we have, and please do, if you have questions, we have, would love to dive into some of these topics in more detail in the panel starting at 3. Yeah, so next we have Kunal Talwar, who is a research scientist at Apple and has led teams looking at privacy, security, federated learning, so excited to hear more from him.
All right, so I guess I want to tell you a little bit about some of the recent work I've been doing. I'll say a little bit more about this topic, but let me start with just giving a high-level introduction of my research interests. So I guess my interest in distributed and federated learning really comes from the motivation of protecting privacy. And I guess that influences kind of the research areas I'm interested in and all of the questions that I like. So I guess a private federated learning or federated statistic systems consists of many different pieces. Many different things need to come together. First, we need to figure out what we compute. Right? So the final output of our computation, whatever, if you're building a histogram, training a model, we want that outcome itself not to leak individual data. And I guess I believe the best way to do that is to make sure that that output is differentially private. And I guess so there's, I think, there's been a lot of work in differentially private statistics, differentially private learning. I think there's still a lot of open questions here and still a lot to do here. Be happy to chat with any of you about those questions. We also want to make sure that the process of the computation itself does not leak individual information. And I guess federated learning kind of goes some ways towards it by doing data minimization. But as we know, kind of if the gradients themselves, for example, can leak information. So I guess I'm interested in sort of ways to ensure that we can actually run our private federated learning or federated statistic algorithms in a way that that the process of learning itself does not leak information. And I guess there's many well-established ways to do it. There's a trusted execution environment that Sean talked about. There's other cryptographic tools like multi-party computation that one can use. I particularly like the two-server model where you have two servers and you trust at least one of them, to be honest. And I guess once you start using these things, there's many interesting questions that come up. You want to, so I guess a lot of the crypto part protects the client from server learning about their data. But as soon as we do that, we have the opposite problem of protecting the server from malicious clients. And I guess there's a lot of very interesting work in zero-knowledge proofs in that setting, and I find that very interesting. I've done some work on that area. And finally, I guess there's the question of the interface. So I guess in principle, we can take any algorithm that you want that's differentially private and run it inside using cryptographic tools, but that's usually not very feasible. So what we want is a small set of primitives that we implement using our most advanced methods, cryptographic tools, or TEs. And I guess that kind of naturally motivates the question of figuring out what primitives we should implement, how powerful any given set of primitives is to run different algorithms of interest. Okay, so with okay, let me just put in a little pitch as well. I guess the topic of this workshop is learning. I guess when we talk about federated learning frameworks, I guess there's a lot of emphasis on learning. But I think if you actually dig deeper in practice, I think it's at least as important, if not more, to do simpler tasks like statistics and means. And I guess even though those are kind of technically some form of learning, I guess those are simpler questions that don't get as much attention as they deserve. And we should all work more on them. So let me tell you about one of these questions. Okay, so I guess I'm interested in this question. I want to learn a distribution. So it's a very basic task in statistics. There's some distribution over 0, 1 to the d. Think of that as, for example, a population distribution in Australia. And my goal is, given n samples from this distribution, I want to estimate this distribution, learn the distribution, whatever that means. What learn means is, I guess I'll output some estimate p twiddle that I think is close to the real distribution. To really define that problem, I need to tell you what I mean by close, and I guess different measures of closeness will lead to different algorithms. In this talk, I'll be interested in what's known as the Earth mover distance between two distributions. So this is kind of the most natural notion of distance between distributions on a metric space. And I guess I will not get into the definition, but if you know it, this is basically the cost of the min-cost matching between the two distributions. OK. So we want a good algorithm for this. What does that mean? We want to measure the performance of the algorithm as I give you n samples. How small Earth mover distance can you ensure? And the typical way we do that is we look at the performance of my algorithm on a distribution Q, given n samples. I take the largest possible value, the worst case of this error, over input distributions Q. And I want to compare it to what any other algorithm could do in the worst case. Right? This is kind of the classical CS approach of doing worst case analysis. Right? And I guess this is really nice when we can do worst case analysis. I don't need to worry about what Q is. I always have a guarantee. Except that if your problem is learning Earth mover distance over 0, 1 to the d, this rate is like n to the 1 over d. So if you think about that a little bit, if d is 10 and you want 0.1, that means you want error to be 0.1, you need 10 to the 10 samples. So this is not really a rate. I mean, I guess it's rate only in the theoretical notion of a rate. It's not really a valid, it's not really a bound that you could actually do anything with. And I guess you can't really beat this. So this is the best one can do. So people have looked at going beyond the worst case, using various notions of dimensionality that are kind of assumptions on this distribution Q. I want to talk about a different approach to doing this that's called instance optimality. So ideally, what I would like is on any given distribution, on any P, I do as well as any other algorithm could do on P. Right, so this is saying instance by instance, I am optimal. My algorithm is as good as any algorithm you could come up with. Of course, this is not really achievable. There is a trivial algorithm that ignores the input and outputs P. The right-hand side is 0. Right? So there's a stronger notion which says, OK, instead of just looking at performance on P, let me look at performance on P and some other P prime, which is another potential input. If you have a good algorithm, it should really do well both on P and P prime. So you measure the performance by the worst performance on P and P prime. And this is kind of a useful notion. This, for one-dimensional problems, you can often actually achieve it. Beyond 1 dimensions, this is almost always not achievable. So we propose a generalization where we say, instead of just looking at performance on two distributions, you look at performance on a neighborhood around P. Right? So there's some notion of neighborhood. And I basically want to do as well as any other algorithm could do on a small ball around P. And I guess as you vary the notion of neighborhood, you can kind of get different notions. Ideally, you would want a very small neighborhood and still achieve this notion. It turns out that you can actually achieve this notion under a very tight notion of neighborhood. That basically, all distributions in the neighborhood have the same support, and any probability can only change by a factor of 2. And I guess I guess I won't get into details. But we can do this both in Augenstein distance, and in more recent work, we showed how you can do this for distribution learning in KL. So I guess that's all I want to say. So worst case analysis is great, but is often not good enough. And you can use instance optimality to go beyond the worst case. And I guess I'll stop here.
We got one more speaker in this session. So we have Patrick Foley, who's joining us here from Flower, so one of the most prominent startups working on federated learning. So I'm really excited to hear from you.
right.
Can I ask you to remove your name tag to
Sure.
to make noise?
And then keep it moving.
You can just put it over
Okay,
there.
sounds
Put that in your pocket or both.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Virginia, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizing committee for putting together this boot camp and workshop. So I'm Patrick Foley. I'm a principal engineer at Flower Labs. Prior to joining Flower Labs, about 4 months ago, I was a principal engineer at Intel, where I've been working for the prior 15 years, leading the Open Federated Learning project, as well as a proprietary service that was built on top of what was called OpenFL at that time. To focus more on confidential compute, governance, a lot of the topics that are natural extensions to open source federated learning. And I've been deeply involved in the confidential compute space since about 2015 for AI. But a lot of the things that I'll be talking about around federated foundation models today really represent the contributions from a much larger Flower team and team at the University of Cambridge. So starting off, I wanted to really position this in two phases, starting off with real-world federated learning and then transitioning into federated foundation models. So OpenFL started in about 2018 as a research collaboration with the University of Pennsylvania, and it was aimed at solving really the real-world production challenges of being able to train AI models on private data. And so in some of the earlier work that Virginia was referencing in the intro slides, on the left side of the screen, this was one of the outcomes of some of that early work. So being able to train a brain tumor segmentation model across 71 healthcare institutions represented by 6 different continents. And this was a major success for federated learning, being able to produce a brain tumor segmentation model that performed 33% better than a model trained on public data alone. OpenFL was also used for generative AI drug discovery. We've worked closely with AbbVie in the past, the pharmaceutical company, on being able to train on their private data sets and then create candidate models, candidate drugs for evaluation and evaluate toxicity, different other properties that you would want to be able to evaluate at early phases of the drug development pipeline. And also real-world deployment across Montefiore's series of, I think, 12 different hospitals in the New York area for COVID-19 prediction. And then one of the other major deployments of OpenFL was actually on the International Space Station back in 2024. So this is really a far-out use case of federated learning that spans both, of course, Earth communication where you have data privacy concerns, but also addresses the aspect of federated learning where there's very low bandwidth between space and Earth at the same time, and being able to handle how you train a model jointly at the same time. So this was really a great thing to see in terms of being able to jointly train a model at the same time for the purpose of improving astronaut health using causal ML. So this brings me to OpenFL was successful for about 5 years, but the community has since joined Flower, starting in about September of this year. And we have myself, the former architect of OpenFL, as well as others from the OpenFL team, as well as the broader OpenFL community that is joining Flower and has been transitioning over for the last few months. And Flower, just to give you an idea for those of you who aren't aware of it, it's the world's most popular federated AI framework. They started around 2020, and they have steadily grown since then and have a number of academic, industry, and consumer partnerships. So there's 7,000 developers that use Flower today. We have 6,600 stars on GitHub, and it's always growing. And we have contributors from all over the world. So the team itself is completely remote. I was the first hire in the West Coast US, but we have most of our team that's based out of Europe, but we have others that are positioned around the world as well. But we're growing all the time, and we accept contributions from those that are also around the world. So part of why I start with the earlier real-world deployments of OpenFL and then transition into Flower is that Flower has a much larger reach in terms of who they work with as well as their academic partnerships. So there's a lot of opportunity beyond these initial federated learning successes in healthcare and finance and other types of verticals. And we're starting to see these crop up really across academia as well as a lot of industries who are starting to see successes and deploy these things both internally and across other institutions really for the first time. So now I'm going to transition a little bit into federated foundation models and some of the work that Flower has been doing in this space in collaboration with the University of Cambridge and the Cambridge ML Systems Lab in particular. So some of the federated foundation model innovations at Flower. Really one of the first ones that's a natural area to look at for foundation models is fine-tuning. Because with fine-tuning, you can use a lot of the existing primitives that you have in federated learning frameworks. You don't have to deal with necessarily the huge parameter size that a lot of these LLMs require you to transmit across the network. And by using techniques like parameter-enhanced fine-tuning as well, and QLoRa and different libraries like bits and bytes, it becomes possible to really shrink down the amount that you need to transfer to a much, much smaller parameter space. And so Flower announced a lot of this work starting in 2024. We have a number of examples that allow people to fine-tune their own LLMs using our infrastructure. But then the extension to that is really benchmarks and a leaderboard for for fine-tuned LLMs in particular. So what's been lacking for a long time is a set of comprehensive benchmarks across the normal areas that you would see LLMs evaluated. Things like code, medical applications, finance, as well as general NLP type of tasks. We have incorporated a set of these benchmarks into this FlowerTune LLM leaderboard. This has been submitted to, was recently presented at ICML, and there's quite a bit of activity and innovation that's happening around this space, not just from Flower, but from the wider community as a result of having this platform for hosting these kinds of capabilities. But really, the bigger task is how to more closely integrate LLMs and foundation models into the frameworks themselves. And so pre-training is an area where Flower, as well as our research hub at the University of Cambridge that we have the benefit of working closely with, have been working on extensions to Flower that allow for pretty vast improvements in pre-training in particular. And just to get kind of concrete into what those look like, there is a new type of optimization called desynced low communication adaptive optimizers that was today accepted to ICLR. And it's the world's first decentralized optimizer with provable convergence. And just to give you a two-sentence explanation or summary of what it does, there is optimizer state that is very valuable in being able to synchronize across the network. You can either ignore it entirely, or you can, historically, you've been able to just send it and then average it at the same time that you would send your normal parameters. What the innovation here is that it decouples the parameter averaging versus the optimizer averaging. And that leads to significantly less communication that's required to happen. And to give you a sense of how this compares to existing distributed training techniques like distributed data parallel and its variants, this technique is operating over 10x slower links, but Flower is still converging faster. So just to give you an idea, DDP represents the end of the wall clock time. It's somewhere in the realm of, I think, 95 to 96 hours. And this particular technique converges in 80% of that time with much lower bandwidth. So that just gives you an idea of the types of capabilities that federated learning opens up, where you don't necessarily have to have extremely fast bandwidth and co-located GPUs in order to do really effective LLM and foundation model training. So across our stack, we have Flower, which has been open source from the beginning, but we also have all of these extensions to Flower, this photon system that has all of these innovations around pre-training of LLMs and being able to train foundation models in that way, but also several other innovations coming from the University of Cambridge as well as other academic groups. These are peer-reviewed publications. It's all open source on GitHub, hosted in Flower as well as other places, and it supports natively heterogeneous hardware, which federated learning, of course, requires. So some adoption of Flower foundation model technology across the industry. So one of the things that we're really excited about in terms of a partnership is with a company called Vana. And what Vana does is they allow users to extract data from platforms that they normally use, whether that be Facebook, Google, other places, and establish these decentralized, what they call data DAOs, which is a place for you to upload your data and with the possibility of monetizing it or overseeing how it gets used by others who actually want to train a model on it. And Flower is working with Vana and training on 1 million, the data represented by 1 million users today, and we're training a model that's called Collective 1. I believe it's a 1.3 billion parameter model, and this is something that was announced at the Flower Summit in 2025, and this work is continuing today. We've also partnered with the government in Germany, SPRIND, as well as a sovereign AI unit in the UK government around training foundation models on a lot of government proprietary data. And this is something that we'll be announcing more results around at the Flower Summit coming up in April. And then these proprietary these other extensions to Flower in the form of the photon system, they've been adopted by others at Stanford, UCL, the Mooresfield Eye Hospital, and this proliferation of being able to effectively train foundation models using open source federated learning is something that is really taking hold, and there's been a lot of success published around this. So just to close things out, that kind of wraps up the real world FL deployments as well as a sample of the foundation model innovations at Flower. But we have the Flower AI Summit coming up April 15th and 16th, and we would love to invite everyone in this room as well as anyone watching online to that conference to hear more about what's happening in the federated foundation model space. So thank you very much.
All right, thank our speakers again. That was wonderful, and I think we're already seeing some really interesting, diverse perspectives on what federated learning looks like right now and what some of the challenges are. So I'm really excited to dig into that in a little bit more detail during the panel. So if you have questions, obviously you can talk to people during the break, but I'd love to hear questions from folks during the panel, which is going to be from 3 to 4. So right now we're going to take a short break. I believe that there are some snacks or coffee outside if you go out to the room here, and we'll come back at 3 for the panel.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, really cool.